Today's video is on one of my favorite chess opening principles. Don't push too many pawns in the opening. Beginning players make this mistake all the time. I have taught so many new players who, if you do not stop them, will immediately advance all of their pawns to the 4th rank. Admittedly, it is fun to move pawns 2 squares forward. However, even more advanced players regularly push too many pawns in the opening, creating weaknesses and neglecting development. Pawns do not move backwards, so every pawn advance loses some flexibility and some ability to control potentially critical squares. Here are 4 tips for sound pawn play in the opening and for punishing unsound play from your opponent. First, push 2, maybe 3 pawns in the opening to control the center and to let your pieces out. Then focus on development and castling. Yes, there are plenty of exceptions and advanced players regularly do break these rules. But when you are learning, keep it simple. Second, when your opponent pushes a lot of pawns, they may be forgetting to develop their pieces. Use your lead in development to attack. Third, attack your opponent's pawns with your pawns, forcing exchanges, further advances, or liquidation of their pawns. If they spend a lot of time moving their pawns and those pawns get traded, they have lost all of that time. Fourth, as we will see in today's game, sacrifice to eliminate their pawns and to open the position. This is the 3rd video in our series, Modern Masterpieces Guaranteed to Improve Your Chess. If you like the content and want to show your appreciation, the best way to do so is to subscribe to the channel. Today's example game sees Georgian Grandmaster Merab Gaganashvili taking on International Master Georgios Sulaitis, aka the Big Greek. Georgios is himself a very popular YouTuber, primarily creating content in German. He has a great video on this game and you should check it out. Georgios is playing black, and he goes for a provocative opening, a personal favorite of mine. This creates a natural conflict between white's central pawns and black's lead in development. When white takes too many liberties with the pawn moves, Georgios finds a brilliant and instructive way to punish him. Gaganashvili opens the game here with pawn d4. We get d5, c4, and knight to c6. This is the Shigorin defense. It has a special place in my heart. I played it in the early 2000s and won many nice games. It was popularized by Grandmaster Alexander Morozevich, a super creative grandmaster who made it as high as number 2 in the live rankings in the world. He inspired me and Georgios and many others to try it at that time. Even Magnus Carlsen has played it, though it's probably a little bit dubious. What it does is create a really interesting conflict where black is going to get rapid development into dynamic position, but black is going to have to give up the bishop pair and a strong pawn center in most cases. It's that rich strategic struggle that I enjoy, and this game is a perfect example. So after knight c6, we see pawn takes d5, queen takes d5. White now has these 2 central pawns versus 1 central pawn, and the bishop's pawn for black, the c pawn, is blocked at least temporarily by the knight. So this is going to be entirely about piece play for black. We get pawn to e3, defending this pawn on d4, e5, attacking the center and freeing the bishop, knight c3, attacking the queen, bishop to b4. Black cannot afford to lose time by retreating the queen, so pinning the knight is the best solution. Bishop d2, bishop takes c3, giving up the bishop pair and strengthening white's center, but keeping the queen active on d5 and not losing time by retreating it. Now, pawn takes on c3. Also, you can take with the bishop, which is a different kind of dynamic and also quite playable for white. Here, after pawn takes c3, we see the perfect tension that we're looking for. White has a big pawn center. White also has the bishop pair, but white also needs to develop this bishop on f1 and the knight on g1 and get castled. And it's not so easy to do those things. For black, it is really important to stay active, to develop your bishop and your knight that you have not yet developed, and castle, and put a lot of pressure on white. If you don't play dynamically and white does complete development, white will have a massive advantage. So we get here knight to f6, and now white plays the very ambitious pawn to f3. This is not a mistake yet, but I do think it's going down the wrong path. Another pawn move, which is the theme of this video today, is a little bit questionable, and white isn't developing the bishop or the knight. More natural, more common, is to play pawn to c4, kicking the queen out of the center, queen d6 and d5. White is giving up flexibility in the middle of the board, but the pawns are very secure now, and it's going to be easier for white to complete development, moving the knight on g1 and the bishop on f1. Instead, after knight f6, pawn to f3, Georgios goes ahead and castles, which is of course incredibly natural. Pawn to e4 in this position, and the queen falls back to d6. White has another opportunity to go back to the idea we were just looking at, advancing in the center, making sure that the pawns are secure, though losing some flexibility and closing the position a little bit. I think this version is a little better for black than the one with c4 that we were looking at, but it's still a playable, favorable position for white. Black should retreat the knight, white plays pawn c4, black plays knight d7, trying to put the knight on c5, establishing a blockade, and then trying to play pawn to f5. I think this is a pretty good amount of counterplay for black, and I would be happy to play this position, but white is probably still better according to the engine. Instead, after queen to d6, we get the move bishop to e3. A mistake, and honestly a pretty surprising one from a player of Gaganashvili's caliber. White is moving a piece a second time in the opening. That's a principle that of course we know we don't want to break, and we'll look at even more in other future games in this series. After bishop to e3 though, the pawn on d4 is very, very solid. And white is planning again to just develop the bishop on f1, the knight on g1, and castle. So Georgios must find a way to use his piece activity to put pressure on the white center, or he will have no hope in this position. After bishop e3, we get pawn takes d4, c takes d4, and rook to e8. The best move in the position, putting a lot of pressure here on this e4 pawn. White, though, might be thinking, hey, my pawns are so solid, so well defended that you cannot attack them. I have all the time in the world to develop my bishop and knight, get castled, and I'm just going to be better. But of course, that is too simplistic, and neither Grandmaster Gaganashvili nor Georgios are thinking in that way in this position. After rook e8, black is putting a ton of pressure on the center, and there are many, many ideas to sacrifice and rip apart the center. We're going to see some of these in the main line of the game, but first, I want to show a line that I consider quite interesting. King f2. Now, this move might seem really silly, but actually it's quite sensible, and you're going to see why in the main line of the game. It's very hard for white to castle and complete development because the bishop is undefended on e3. So moving the king off of the very dangerous e-file and defending the bishop would be a good idea, except that here we have an incredible refutation. Rook takes e4. A rook sacrifice, and a thrilling line that I just had to show. After rook takes e4, we get here pawn takes e4. And knight takes e4 with check. It turns out that there is no safe place for the king to hide. The first thing you might consider is king f3, advancing and attacking the knight on e4. But the knight does not need to be defended. Black can play queen f6 check, and in all lines, white is losing. For example, king takes e4, queen to f5 with a very pretty checkmate. Also, if bishop to f4, there's a nice tactical sequence. Bishop to g4 check, king takes g4. You can't really retreat the king because there was a skewer and the queen would fall, but now the queen falls in a different way. Knight to f2 check with a royal fork. Backing up, a more simpler way to lose after knight takes e4 check is simply to play e2, king e2, and then knight c3 is a royal fork, hitting the queen and the king. Finally, though, there is a more complicated line. After knight takes e4 check, the king can go to e1. Absolutely the best try in the position. But now black can play queen b4 check. Again, the king cannot run up to e2 because there is the royal fork knight c3. So the bishop needs to block on d2. Queen takes d4, picking up a pawn. The 3 pawns for the piece are not so important here, but the real problem for white is there's no good defense to queen f2 checkmate, to simply developing this bishop and including the rook, and also to the idea of picking up this rook on a1 if white plays a move like queen to e2 right here, which is actually the best move according to the engine. That's right, white is so busted here that the engine says the only thing I can see is to move the queen up and just lose a whole rook for nothing in this position. So black is totally winning. Backing up. That was a very pretty line after the idea of king f2 and then the sacrifice of a whole rook. But we get a more natural move, queen to d2 in the game. This move is actually given a question mark by Georgios and by annotators at the time, but I'm not even sure it's deserved because there's not really a good option available to white. In almost all lines, black has strong sacrifices. If you want to pause your video, it is a great time to find Georgios' continuation. And yes, he did have it prepared in advance. It is the brilliant move bishop to f5, a beautiful stunner. Now, it's not hard to see that the bishop can't be captured. If pawn takes f5, then simply knight to d5. This bishop is pinned and will be won. Black is immediately regaining the material, has fractured the center, has opened the e-file, and it is just a crushing attack in position for black. But a big question is, what if you just don't capture the bishop? A lot of people looking at this position might think, hey, white still has a really solid center. That f3 pawn is holding up that pawn on e4. Black doesn't have good pawn moves to attack the center, so I have all the time in the world. I can just move my bishop out, move my knight out. I'm going to castle, and then I'm going to be doing great. But of course, the point is, you actually can't just do all that so easily because black is going to sacrifice the bishop on e4 in most lines. Black will get 2 pawns for the piece. Black will open the e-file. Black will demonstrate the power of the activity of the black pieces against the undeveloped white pieces. And this is going to be close to winning against almost anything that white does. Even though you see it coming, there's just no great way to stop the idea of bishop takes e4. This is very, very instructive. One of our ideas to punish too many pawn moves in the opening is to sacrifice to eliminate those pawns and reveal the weaknesses in our opponent's position. And this is an absolutely perfect example. The best move, according to the engine, is bishop to d3, and then there are a number of good moves, including knight to b4. I personally really like the move knight to d5. White isn't yet lost here, but white is much worse, and it's very, very dangerous. The best moves, according to the engine, are knight e2, and then black can go ahead and pick up this bishop on e3 and play rook to d8. In this position, there's actually no defense to the capture of the pawn on d4, and black is going to be much, much better. Maybe not winning, but much, much better. So, backing up, we see Gaganashvili try bishop to e2. This move makes almost as much sense as any other move, but it does not prevent bishop takes e4. Another brilliant sacrifice, the intention behind bishop f5. As we said, you can see it coming, but it's very, very hard to stop. So after bishop takes e4, we get pawn takes e4, knight takes e4, and now queen to b2. In this position, Georgios makes really the only mistake that I think he makes in the game. He thinks he makes another one, but we'll talk about that later, and I'm not so sure I agree that it's a mistake. After queen b2, in this position, very simple, very strong for black, is knight to b4. And black simply intends to put the knight on d5, creating or increasing the pressure on the bishop on e3, and black's position is, if not winning, very close. It is a tremendous attack. Instead, Georgios goes for a very, very pretty move that, if you see it, most of us would not be able to resist playing, but it proves to be a little bit inaccurate, and it gives his opponent one opportunity to get back in the game. This is the move knight to g3. This move reveals the attack here on the bishop on e3, and it is attacking this trapped rook on h1. Why is this move actually not so good? Well, first, there's a crazy computer move we're going to look at in a moment, but also, as Georgios points out, this move is going to force white to capture on g3, opening this rook on h1. And the rook, without the capture on g3, would be very out of play for the foreseeable future. You didn't need to open it, and the opening up of the rook gives white some life, some hope in the position. After knight g3, the crazy computer move that is best and actually gives white an advantage is bishop to f4. I cannot even imagine conceiving of this move in the position. It's such a computer move, but actually white is better after this move. It's still very complicated. It's not like Georgios has gone off the deep end, but white is a little better according to the engine. After bishop f4, queen takes f4, pawn takes g3. The whole point of bishop f4 is that white is losing the bishop anyway, but now white is going to capture on g3 and attack the queen here on f4. As a result, white black either has to take on d4, which allows a trade of queens, which isn't what black is going for. Black has good compensation for the sacrificed piece even there, but that's not what black is trying to do, or black captures on g3 with check. And then the king goes to f1. And that's actually a really important idea in this position. The best square for the white king is on f1. It's not to castle on the king side, which white is never going to achieve anyway, and it's not to castle on the queen side, something we're going to see a bit more of in a little bit. Instead, the king is as well placed as it can be here on f1. There's the idea of knight f3, of rook h3, and white is very, very weak on the dark squares, but black does not have a dark squared bishop or a knight that can easily get to e4 or g4. If those things existed, black would be crushing it in this position. But actually, white is fairly safe and can now try and uncoil and actually hope to use the extra piece. So, backing up, after knight g3, unsurprisingly, Gaganashvili does not find the stunning move bishop to f4. So he goes ahead and captures on g3. Now, you might be tempted to capture on g3 with check, but you would have bishop to f2 in that position, saving the bishop that black is about to capture and counterattacking the queen. So, after h takes g3, Georgios captures on e3, and this is a critical moment for white. At this point, white can get a viable position, not one that I would desire to play, but a viable position with rook to d1. This move is very unintuitive because you're leaving your king in the center of the board. But again, the key is that the place the king belongs is on f1. After queen takes g3 check, king f1, and then, for example, queen f4 check, bishop to f3, black has enough compensation with rook to d8 or rook to e8, but black is not necessarily better according to the engine. I would still want to play black. I still love attacking this position, but this defense on f3 is actually pretty solid. Instead, white goes ahead and castles. It makes so much sense to try to castle to get your king out of the center of the board. If you're going to play rook d1, why not just castle anyway, and your king must be better on c1 than on e1, right? Well, wrong. It's better on e1 where it can slide to f1. And it's important to note that this only really works because this rook has the open h-file created by that knight g3 move. Otherwise, you couldn't put the king on f1 because the rook would have nowhere to go. But since the rook already has a half-open h-file, it's okay that you're giving up on castling and leaving the king in the rook's traditional path. After castling, it's back to Georgios on the attack. He has renewed his attacking chances and he finds the right way to continue with knight to b4. It might not look like black has a threat, but actually there's a big one. Rook to c3 check, which occurs, for example, after pawn to a3, rook c3 check, king b1, and the big check is queen g6 check. Coming from the other side of the board, but delivering a nasty, devastating check, king a1, and rook takes a3 check is really, really pretty. If the queen captures and there's no other alternative, then knight c2 check is going to fork the king and queen, winning the queen. So after knight b4, bishop c4 defends a2 so that rook to c3 check with the idea that the capture of the rook allows the knight fork doesn't work. So bishop c4 defends the rook c3 check idea, but boom, the bishop is a target. Pawn to b5. If the bishop just retreats in this position, then black can play a number of good moves like pawn to a5 or rook to e8, which is the computer's preference, and the attack continues. If bishop takes b5, by the way, here you can play rook c3 check, but you should never capture a pawn like this in front of an open king, even if black doesn't win tactically with rook c3 check. Simply rook to b8 is crushing. You should never, ever take a pawn and open up your king like this. So after b5, though, there is an important alternative, and Gaganashvili plays bishop takes f7 check. This is not right. It doesn't work, but it's very resourceful, and I love the attempt in this position. We saw that after bishop b3, the best move according to the engine, the attack is very strong anyway. This move creates a lot of problems for Georgios to solve, even if it doesn't work. After king takes f7, there's queen f2 check. The point, we have here a double attack on the king and on the rook. Now, this is where Georgios mentioned that he is still kicking himself over not playing what he considers the best move. But it turns out he's pretty much equally winning in the game continuation. So he may be kicking himself for not playing king to g8 in this position, but I think it's just an aesthetic choice. We'll see the game continuation in a moment, but after king g8, the point is that yes, white can pick up the rook. Black is now down a rook, but queen c6 check, king to d2. We should actually point out also what happens after king b2. There's queen c2 check, king a3, and then queen to a4 check, king b2, queen takes a2 check, king up to c3, and in this position, you can actually sacrifice the knight for checkmate. Queen c2 check, king takes b4, a5 check, king takes b5, you can throw the rook in with check, and you're going to mate on the a file. The pretty way is to finish with queen to a8 check right here. At this point, there should be all kinds of applause and everything. It's such a pretty way to finish by retreating the queen into the corner to mate the king on the 7th rank. In the main line, after queen c6 check, the king is going to try to run to the center, king to d2. So after king d2, we get queen c2 check, king e1. And here's where Georgios couldn't find the right way to continue the attack in this position, and he went for the line we're going to see in the game. But as he points out, actually queen takes g2, just picking up the pawn, is winning. The point is that there are two threats. One is knight c2 check with another royal fork. There are a lot of royal fork ideas in this game. And the rook on h1 is simply hanging, so this is a nice way to conclude the attack. Instead, after queen f2 check, Georgios played queen to f6. Now, the line, if the rook is captured, is very similar, and there's actually a nice point. If queen takes e3, then there's queen c6 check, king d2, queen c2 check, king to e1, and now not queen takes g2, which was the winning move in the line with the king on g8. Here, after queen takes g2, white could trade queens with queen to f3 check. because the king is on f7 instead of on g8. But here, the king on f7 allows for rook e8, winning the queen on e3, and black is crushing in this position. So after queen f6, because that line is winning, we see Gaganoshvili play queen takes f6 check, going for the endgame. Unfortunately, this is a bad endgame, but grandmasters have gotten away against international masters in many, many bad endgames before, so it's definitely worth a shot. Fortunately for us, as viewers of this game, the finish is still very, very pretty. After queen takes f6, we get king takes f6, rook to f1 check, king to g6, knight f3, pawn to h6, a good move giving the king space to hide, knight h4 check, king to h7. At this point, rook to f7 is seeking counterplay, which makes a lot of sense, but black is actually much faster with play in this position. Rook takes g3, which defends this pawn right here so that there's no way to get that pawn with knight f5, and rook takes g7, and this rook is also attacking the pawn on g2, forcing the knight to defend it. After rook takes g3, there's rook takes c7, rook to f8, looking to double, one of my favorite things to do with rooks in the endgame or at any time. Rook takes f7, rook to f2, king to b1 because the a2 pawn was under attack, and knight d5. This is a beautiful move. The threat of knight c3 check is monstrous. Here we get king a1 trying to hide in the corner, b4, continuing the idea of knight c3, and after pawn to b4, rook a5, the knight is under attack. It can go in with knight c3, which is really strong, but Georgios finds an even better move. Rook to a3, a very, very pretty finish, sacrificing the knight. If the knight is captured here with rook takes d5, then we can just go play rook takes a2, king b1, rook a1. This is a skewer, and the rook on h1 falls when black is up lots of material and has a crushing position. Instead, after rook a3, rook takes a3, pawn takes a3. The material is actually equal, but black is simply checkmating. Rook over to c1, trying to stop knight c3, and then rook to a2 checkmate, but it doesn't stop it because of knight c3 anyway, and rook takes, and rook to f1 is forcing checkmate on the back rank thanks to this nice pawn on a3. This is a beautiful, beautiful game from Georgios. I hope you enjoy it. It is a crystal clear example of the risks of pushing too many pawns and of the struggle that exists in many games between piece activity and pawn play. I love Georgios' play throughout the game. It's very aesthetic, even in the endgame. But most importantly, I love the instructive idea of playing bishop f5 and then bishop takes e4, sacrificing a piece to eliminate the pawns and finish the attack. If you want to see more games in the series, of course, subscribe to the channel, or you can click the video that has just popped up with another beautiful, instructive game in our series on modern masterpieces, guaranteed to improve your chess.